If you haven't already, be sure to create your free Doug membership today by clicking on the Doug Hub tab in the left menu bar to access year-round community content, local meetups, and more. Closing the conference is veteran speaker Nigel Cox. Please welcome him as he will be ending the conference with his session, D365 F&O Manufacturing Costing. Please stick around after Nigel's session for a live Q&A.
Welcome, fellow Doug superheroes. My name is Nigel Cox. I started my own business at the beginning of this year, but I've been working with Dynamics since 3.0. I implemented my first ERP system back in 1975, implementing Mapix, and I've been doing ERP ever since. So what we're talking about today is manufacturing costing in finance and operations. I'm a manufacturing guy, right? No excuses. So here's my contact information. If you have any questions at the end of the presentation, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm a big believer in pay it forward and love to help out with the community. Here's our objectives today. We want to understand the goals of Dynamics 365 supply chain cost methods, briefly understand the pros and cons of the different methods that are available to us, and then talk about just the handling of item costs, with an emphasis on manufacturing, but including distribution. Now, clearly, if you were dealing with distribution costs, we are not dealing with routings and BOMs, but we are dealing with costs. So the first question is, what is an item cost? If you think about it, a business can tell whether they're making money or not making money without ever knowing what an item cost is. They've got their accounts payable, their accounts receivable. They can look at the big picture and know whether they're making money or not. Why do we need to know an item cost, a cost for each and every item? So I'll let you think about that for a moment. Okay, this is my answer. Primarily so we can develop an estimated cost per unit for every financially material, stocked or stockable item with a balance sheet impact. What do I have in inventory? How many dollars do I have in inventory for this item? And I do emphasize financially material. My advice is don't make the mistake of thinking every nut and bolt and screw needs to be costed. You do have the ability on the BOM to say this is not material for costing, and it can keep things a little more straightforward. But also, you may want to use an estimated cost for specific services or charges, expensing stuff, i.e. not keeping a balance sheet entry, not keeping an on-hand count or inventory, but you still want to incur the cost or see the cost in your P&L. And Dynamics can help you with that as well. So what kind of business decisions, why are we doing it, right? Why do we need an item cost? Well, the first answer to that is to meet GAAP, right? We have to be able to value inventory, which means we've got to have a cost on record for every item in our inventory. So that's number one. But number two, to help us make business decisions based on cost and implied margin. So I'm going to personally assume, speaking as an engineer who came from the era of value engineering, you're already reducing costs, right? You don't have to know an item cost to know that having the machine setup time reduced is going to reduce its cost, or its runtime shortened. So there are ways of reducing cost without ever knowing an item cost. Same with sales price. You're going to try and optimize your sales price, regardless of whether or not you know the cost that's behind it. Obviously, you increase the price, you increase the margin. The question on the sales price side is, will customers still buy it? Not what was the cost. Now, knowing it is going to help us get a better understanding of profitability, but you actually don't have to know it. The other thing is actually to revise and tune the sales price. If we do see that we're not making money on our item, we might want to raise its price. So again, knowing the cost can definitely help. Cost alternatives. I might want to find a new source. I want to make rather than buy, or buy rather than make. Or I might want to redesign it, right? I'm not selling it for a profit. How can I make it cheaper? And the final one is, do I even want to sell this thing? Do I want to continue or discontinue product based on what I think its cost is? And to monitor trends. This one to me is far more important. You're going to hear me say over and over, there is no such thing as a real cost. All we can do is estimate it. But if whatever way we're estimating it, it seems to be going up, then it is probably going up. And then you want to ask yourself why. So if you see the trends, it can help you diagnose and understand your cost basis. I do want to, this is the only thing I'm going to say about lean accounting in this presentation. If you're using best practice in lean accounting, you actually don't care about the individual item costs. Although everything in Dynamics Lean is standard costed, if you're doing it right, you're actually asking yourself if the value stream is profitable rather than the item. That's for another session one day, but I just want to get that kind of out of the way. So what do we really know for each item and every item? This is the hows. And you can see all those people scratching their heads. I kind of want you to be scratching your head right now, because you're going to have some visibility of the manufacturing cost. The true manufacturing cost is only something we can aim for. Same with purchase price. You just take, for example, I am buying some stuff from China, and I've loaded a container with all my stuff. That costs money. How much, and I'm shipping 10 different items. How much should each item get of that container cost? And you have to kind of come up with some arbitrary answers. If you have any kind of fixed costs when you're dealing with a vendor, how do you apportion that? I really want to get the point across. We're only trying to come up with some idea of our cost, idea of whether we are making money or not. However, if we do have that, then we can absolutely use those numbers, those estimates, to try and help us with our cost reduction, our sales pricing, our make versus buy, and do we continue or discontinue. Okay, the big choices in Dynamics are standard cost versus actual cost. Why might we choose a standard cost? And by the way, I will tell you right now, other things being equal, if there's no particular reason to choose an actual cost, I recommend to most of my clients to go with standard costs, and I'll try and explain why I say that. But emphasis on other things being equal. There are definitely situations, scenarios where actual cost is going to be much better. But actual cost is rather tempting, because one of the big questions we want to know is, hey, I just made a sale. Did I make money? If you're using actual cost, then right on that sales line, you've got an estimate of actual cost and you have your sales price. Did I make money or not? If I'm using a standard cost, I have already pre-calculated a standard cost for some period of time, and I can answer the question, did I make money over my standard cost? But how did my standard cost compare with my actual cost? So there's a very tempting target there of saying, well, I'm going to use actual cost because I want to know every time I sell something, did I make money or not? So what is a standard cost? It's permanent for some time frame. My first Dynamics client on 3.0 sold gold, bullion, and gold coins. And they actually went with standard cost, but they recalculated it every night. Every night, they basically marked to the market price of gold to find out, am I net positive or negative in the inventory I'm carrying? And their goal was always to be neutral. So they would buy and sell on the spot market to ensure that. But most people, when they're using standard cost, they're probably revaluing it once a year, unless for a particular item there's some good reason to revise the standard cost. So the difference between the standard and the actual in Dynamics is posted as a profit and loss variance, and the inventory is always valued at whatever the current standard is. Standard cost revisions immediately update your GL inventory account. So as you revise a standard cost, like that company I was telling you about, they had inventory revaluations every day. But here's my point, why I like it. It's great to know whether you made money, but it's even better if you know what to do about if you're not making money, or you're not making enough money. And the nice thing with the standard cost is that you're differentiating between, was the cost wrong or the sales price wrong? If you're going with actual cost, it's very easy for the salesman to say, well, it costs too much. You need to reduce the cost. And it's very easy for the supply chain guy to say, or gal, to say, hey, your price is wrong. And guess what? No forward movement. But if once a year you set your standard costs and your purchasing department and your operations team buy into those standards, and your salespeople say, yes, we can make money on those standards, then you can immediately tell on the sales line, was it my cost that was a problem, or was it my sales price that was a problem? Or at least get a good idea of it. That's my main reason for preferring standard cost, because what I want to do is get better, not just know information. So the next question is when to revise and when to update. Like I said, most people will do it annually. Especially if you're using it as a performance measure, right? I am setting this as a target for my supply side, and I'm setting it as a target for my sales side. How often do I want to move that target? So most people will do this once a year when they're doing their annual budgeting. Now, if we go with actual cost in Dynamics, we actually have a few choices. There is only one way of doing standard cost, period. Here are the various options. And what we're really doing is as we receive stuff, we know what we paid for it, or we got some idea of what it cost us in manufacturing because we know the bill of materials, we know the cost of that inventory that we took out, and we know what we're saying per hour running our machine or using our people is, and we'll talk later about overheads, but they figure here too. So you've got some value that's already in inventory. You've got a new inbound you've got some idea of its actual cost. How do you value what's now in inventory? So the first one I've listed here is something called average date weighted. And that actually, I'm not a big fan of the way that's named. That is what you would classically think of as a weighted average. Because it basically is going to say, if I got 200 in stock and I got 100 coming in, it's going to take 2/3 of the new value from what's in stock and 1/3 from what's coming in on an ongoing basis. Now, the next one in Dynamics is something called weighted. Weighted is actually period weighted. So what that is doing is it's looking at all the inbounds for that period and basically saying, okay, I am going to value my inventory for that period at the weighted average of all my inbounds. And finally, there's something called moving average, which is probably the most recent one that Microsoft has added. We'll talk later about some of the fun that you have with physical versus financial. But the bottom line is if your invoice comes in at a different value than you had on the purchase order, date weighted, period weighted are going to get revised. And it'll be kind of potentially last minute surprises. So some companies would rather that the difference between the invoice and the purchase price gets posted as a kind of variance. So moving average is the same as date weighted, but it doesn't get revised by any invoice discrepancies with the purchase order. The next one is LIFO and LIFO financial. A lot of people, in fact, I wasn't aware of this LIFO financial till relatively recently. LIFO means last in, first out. So the cost of the last in is the cost of the first taken out of your inventory. LIFO financial basically says, I am going to time which was first and which was last based on the invoice date. And LIFO is I'm going to time which was first and which was last based on the receipt date. And finally, FIFO, first in, first out. But you need to know that during the month, as you're transacting, it's going to get transacted at date weighted, as long as it's not standard. Actually, if somebody would like to contribute in the comments, it occurred to me today that moving average is probably being kept up to date because it is the physical form of date weighted. It just doesn't get updated with the invoices. So the others, however, will be revised whenever you do something called an inventory calculation. So you can run an inventory calculation as often as you want. You probably want to run it at least as often as your period closing. But if you want to get less surprises at the end of the month, you might want to run inventory calculation more often than once a month. And what it will do, it will take all of your transactions that were date weighted and revalue them based on LIFO financial, or FIFO. And then there's inventory closing. So you run your calculation and then you run your inventory close. Inventory close basically finalize costs. It won't do that unless, for instance, your purchase orders have been invoiced. But it's a very important step to be able to report that month. We'll talk about more on that later. You do have the ability, though I've not seen anybody do it, to calculate your actual cost per batch, per serial, if you want to. I have seen people quite frequently want to calculate their actual, on whatever method, warehouse by warehouse. If any of you are actually got actual cost by batch or serial, I'd love for you to reach out to me because I'd love to hear the business case for doing that. Now, I am going to argue that even if you go actual cost, you might want a nominal standard anyway, for the same reasons that I kind of like standard cost. I want to know some kind of target value that I want to compare my supply and compare my sales with. Another reason for doing it is that if you do an inventory adjustment, or a cycle count, and I will talk about this, I'll repeat this later, and it takes inventory down, it will take it out at your actual cost. But if you add inventory, it does not know what cost to use. So it will actually look to a nominal, what I'm calling a nominal standard. So if you have activated a standard cost for an actual cost item, it's never going to value inventory that way, except when you add inventory through an adjustment or a cycle count. Obviously, if you've got a purchase order, you have a price on it. If you have a manufacturing order, you've got all the sources of cost to calculate it. But if you're doing an adjustment, Dynamics just doesn't know. And beware, if you have not set an actual standard, which keep in mind, you can do by site and other dimensions. If you have not activated one, it will look to the item master. And whatever it sees on the item master, it will use. A lot of people do an actual cost, leave it at zero. Guess what? You add inventory, it's going to get added to your books at zero. Watch out for that. And I think I've pretty much covered all this. Oh, the one thing I didn't say is that the inventory close just isn't relevant for standard cost. And as far as I know, it's not relevant for the moving average either. So for all actual cost methods, transactions are costed at date weighted and only reset to period weighted moving average, FIFO and LIFO, a recalc. I am not sure about that moving average. It only occurred to me today that moving average probably doesn't get reset. It's only finalized at close and only when financially closed. So if you have financially closed a period, and the receipt was costed in the previous period, then you can end up with a prior period adjustment in the current period. So again, watch out for that. How about negative on hand, right? As you probably know, you have an option to permit negative on hand. Think for a moment about why you would ever want that. Well, if you don't permit negative on hand, then you cannot do a transaction that will drive you negative on hand. So imagine for example, in production, that you are backflushing your materials and you try and report as finished and it drives one of your materials negative. You are not going to be able to do that report as finished. Now you can't put it in inventory. Now you can't ship it. Now you basically can't sell it. So a lot of people, especially those using backflushing, will allow negative on hand. In advanced warehouse, you do have the ability to only allow negative on hand for certain locations, and I recommend doing that in this particular example I gave. So allow negative on hand for a input location that you're going to backflush from, but don't allow negative on hand for a warehouse location. Just my advice. Now, think about the effect of negative on hand. When we're looking at an average actual cost, we are dividing the total cost by the quantity on hand. Well, what do you do when the total quantity on hand is negative? Believe it or not, you can actually, because of the physical and financial work, you can have an actual on-hand count and a negative dollar value. Guess what? Finance people don't much like that. Now, if you have a standard cost, then negative inventory will be negative value. And positive inventory will be positive value, which is, not great. I still don't want negative dollars of inventory, but it's kind of better than having a negative dollars and positive actual. So here's my little graphic. By the way, all these pictures are from Copilot. Thank you, Copilot. Negative on hand, where did it go, right? So, there's a big case for saying don't allow negative on hand, but have a really well-defined program for what happens when the inventory is driven negative. Force a cycle count, that kind of thing. Now, let's talk about physical versus financial. And again, thank you, Copilot, I love this picture. But I did add some narration to it. So Mr. Physical here is saying, hey, I got it. That's what matters. And Mr. Financial is saying, yeah, and you don't give a damn what it costs us, right? So we do care what that invoice is. And we do care when we end the production order. We have all the costs now. We do care what that all adds up to. So physical versus financial, it's only financial, generally speaking, after physical, as PO receipts are invoiced. So in the actual world, our inventory value is going to be updated. In the standard cost world, our variances are going to be updated. As productions are ended, in the actual world, it's going to update the inventory value, and it's going to zero out WIP, right? Keep in mind that with actual costing, you can have a negative WIP, and in standard costing, you can have negative WIP until you financially close, and that will force it to zero. There are other transactions that skip physical. So a transfer order, shipment, and receipt is immediately a financial transaction. Count journals are immediately financial transactions, and WMS adjustments are immediately financial transactions. I didn't list it here, but movement journals would also be immediately financial transactions. How about machine versus labor direct cost? So when you are dealing with manufacturing, machine costs and labor costs are both sources. If we get time later, I'm going to talk a little bit about how they used to do costing like 100 plus years ago, where almost everything was labor and not much was machine. And machine was considered more of an overhead cost. But these days, with automation and so forth, the machine cost can be a very significant part of the cost and might be better treated as direct. So let's talk about how 365 supply chain treats those two. Well, one option is to ignore one of them. So, for example, I could say I ignore my machine costs. It's all overhead. Or I could say I ignore labor. That's all part of overhead. The next simplest is include a labor rate cost in the machine hourly rate. So, it costs me so much to run this machine, and it costs this much more to man it. So I end up with an hourly rate for the machine, or maybe a unit rate per unit produced that takes into account the labor content. Now, you won't be able to distinguish the labor content from the machine content, but you still will end up with arguably a more representative cost. And finally, more complex, actually, it's maybe not be finally, have a machine per unit of output and a labor run cost at a rate per hour. If the setup costs are provided, these can be amortized into machine quantity rates or costed per hour for combined labor and machine. Now, you can do that with a single routing step. The final one is actually separate the machine and the labor into two routing steps. But One must be made primary. Generally speaking, people are going to pick the machine, and one can be made secondary, but you force them to be the same operation number. So you cannot have two routings with the same, step number 30, unless one of them is primary and one or more are secondary. Now, keep in mind that with both, you can have a number of resources and a efficiency, if you will, or a percent of time. At least on the secondary, you can have percent of time. So the primary might say the machine is running for 10 hours. And the secondary may say, I need 3 people manning that machine, and I need them all about 40% of the time the machine's running. Believe it or not, you could say, I have 10 people running 3 machines. I've never seen anybody do that, but you could have a number of resources on the machine step as well. You can declare a load factor and, as I said, a crew size for the secondary operation. And you can have setup, run, and quantity costs for each step. Keep that in mind. In Dynamics, you can put time on setup, run, and quantity. So setup is going to be amortized across the batch size. Run is per unit of the run. And quantity is basically saying, I'm not going to care about the hours. I am going to actually directly key in a cost per unit produced. I've never seen anybody use the setup and run hours and also use the quantity. It's like one or the other. I used to work in the paper industry. Think of a paper mill. They did everything based on the linear foot of paper coming off the machine. But they didn't have a setup and run time contribute to the costs. It was all per unit of production. Labor and machine time reporting. I'm a big fan, other things being equal, of back flushing, but you can pre-flush based on the route group that your routing step is tied to. Keep in mind, if you pre-flush, you're pretty much guaranteed that you're going to drive inventory negative. You could also enter an elapsed time on the route or job cards. So you're basically saying after the fact, okay, this step took this amount of time, and post it on a route card or a job card. Or you can use the manufacturing execution system in Dynamics to actually clock on and clock off. So I'm starting on this operation, I'm finished on this operation. And finally, you could be using Internet of Things with an interface. And Dynamics does provide a stub for doing that and actually capture those log on and log off times, especially for the machine itself. So those are your 4 options for reporting labor and machine. Keep in mind in MAS, if you're not using IoT, but you want to log on and log off the machine, then you have to basically have in a sense, somebody on the MES system who's pretending to be the machine. Now we talk about overheads. So let's first of all talk about material overhead. So you can burden your material cost with things like, hey, my purchasing department costs me money, and I want to include the cost of my buyer placing that order. Or you may want transportation. If you pay for the transportation, you may want that to be a part of your inventory value for whatever you transported. You may have royalty charges, that kind of thing. So the simplest option is ignore it, right? I am going to treat all those things as part of my overhead. And I'm not going to put it into my inventory value. Next simplest is handle with miscellaneous charges. So I can use miscellaneous charges to add to the cost of my inventory. On your miscellaneous charge setup, you basically choose, rather than an offset account or vendor, you can choose item that is going to include that cost in your inventory value. If you are standard cost, then you can do the same thing. But when you are on your cost version, when you're actually activating the cost, you have to say, please include miscellaneous charges. And it will only work with the automated miscellaneous charges. Nice thing about actual is you can key in or load your actual charges for that particular receipt. Also, somewhat simple, use the costing sheet and handle with a material overhead based on percent of direct cost or cost per unit. We'll be talking later more about the costing sheet, but it is in Dynamics, and it's an alternative approach to miscellaneous charges, and I would argue a more powerful approach. Manufacturing overhead. Again, simplest is ignore it. And if you ignore both the material overhead and the manufacturing overhead, I call that contribution costing. So your cost of your inventory, your cost of goods sold contributes to the cost of the item. All your overheads have to also be taken into account. And I think this is relatively popular in Europe, so that when you are looking at, am I making money or not, you're looking at your direct costs for your product, and you know that your direct costs aren't covering all your costs. So then you ask the question, rather than item by item and sales by sales, is the difference between my revenue and my cost of goods sold covering my overhead? I don't see a lot of this in the United States. Next simplest is pre-burden the machine labor and or subcon rates per hour. This was that second option we talked about, where you're basically inflating your machine hours rates with the labor that the machine needs. In theory, you could do it the other way around. I'm basing it on labor, and I'm adding in a cost for the machines that they use. In Dynamics 365, there is a separate subcontract cost source. So you got machine, labor, material, subcontract, overheads, which I think is a rather nice addition that Microsoft provided. And they could be rates per hour, and they could also be rates per units. And then the full-on costing sheet, where you can do all the things I've listed here. Cost versions. So cost versions are mostly applicable for standard cost. They are the platform on which you activate your standard cost. So what a lot of people will do is they'll have a cost version for the financial year. So I've got my 2024 costing. I'm doing it under a cost version. But keep in mind, if you have more than one cost version, whichever one you activate from will update the standard. So you have the ability to block cost versions from being activated. So a prior year one, you'd probably want to block it so that nobody can keep updating their standard costs. Some people will actually have two cost versions for the current year, one for what they did at the beginning of the year, and another one for any revisions they did during the year. You know, imagine that you got the bill of materials wrong, or imagine that there's a commodity in your material list that is highly market sensitive. And in the middle of the year, that particular commodity is now like tripled in price. That might be a basis for revaluing your standards and revaluing your inventory. But maybe you want to do that under a different cost version than the one you used at the beginning of the year. But it also can be used for what-if analysis. So you can use what they call a planned cost version, where you're just playing, right? What would the cost be if? And you could change overhead rates and so on and so forth. There is a copy capability. So I can say, take last year's costs, copy it to this year's costs, but up it by this percentage. There is a calculation capability for materials and machine. I'm not quite sure why I indented that. And machine and labor and subcontract and overheads. So if you are using even on the material cost, if you're using miscellaneous charges, or you're using a percentage on your costing sheet, you have to run the calculation for Dynamics to recognize that new standard cost. So when do they get recognized? Forget if any of you can hear my cat meowing, forgive me, that's not me. When does material, machine, labor, subcontract, direct, and overhead breakdown get recognized? And this is actually a big deal. So it's recognized at the order level. So a purchase order will have its breakdown. What was the material content? What was the direct content, and what was the miscellaneous charge content, or what was the direct content and what was the overhead content? And there could be more than one source of overhead against a receipt of purchased materials. And you do say, am I going to do that calculation for an actual cost item at receipt or at invoice? But it's one choice or the other, I believe, per company. So you have to decide early on. It will get recognized at receipt if you've got it set that way, or at invoice if you've got it set the other way. With labor, machine, and contract, it only gets recognized at the end of when you end a production order. And there's a good reason for that, right? You don't know for example, what lot size to amortize your fixed costs on until you know what lot you actually ended up receiving. So if you do a partial receipt on a production order, you really don't know how to share all the overheads and fixed costs like setup at that moment in time. So it will basically, in the standard cost world, it'll put it into inventory at standard. In actual cost world, it will put it into inventory at nominal, what I was describing earlier, until you end that production. And again, be careful. It may be putting it in at zero. So I've got to beware at the end here. Once it is received into inventory, all distinction between material, machine, labor, subcontract, and overhead is lost. At that point, if it's used in a parent production order, it will all be considered material cost. So you only get to know when you're looking at an order, you only get to know what was the labor and machine content that was added at that level. Any subassembly or fabrication that was done at lower levels is now considered material cost. I have worked with many other systems where every production order had a this level cost and lower level cost breakout by material, machine, labor, subcontract, direct, and overhead. And if you were using a material, that got brought into the lower level cost and aggregated the lower level cost for the parent item. So you could very easily say, what's the material content of my finished good? You can't do that in Dynamics 365, though a lot of people have been asking for it, frankly, for 15 years. But it would mean a pretty serious revision to the way that our BOMs and our routings, our production BOMs and our production routings are treated for costing. There are ideas out there. If any of you would like to vote for them to incorporate this level and lower level costs, and therefore know the aggregate level of material, labor, overhead at our finished goods. And there are many companies that have basically reverse engineered it. So they've written reports that go back and look at the components that went into all the way down the bill of materials and will aggregate the material content of their inventory. So, I mean, I didn't make this clear, but if you want to know the material content of your inventory, you really can't do that very easily unless you write these reverse engineer reports. Now, I'm providing this for reference only. This is a little Visio that I created myself to look at the costing sheet. We don't have time today to get into the costing sheet in a fantastic amount of detail, but this Visio might help you break out all the different ways that you can calculate overheads and on what basis. So, you know, is my basis labor when I'm doing a production overhead, or is it material, or is it a combination of the two? Is my basis units, or is my basis hours? The costing sheet is capable of doing all of those. I actually like it a lot. But it's very easy to end up with a costing sheet that is extremely complicated. You know, if you have 200 machines on the floor and you've got different overhead calculations for every machine, and those overheads are trying to separate labor overhead from machine overhead based on units and based on hours, you can end up with a costing sheet that is almost getting unmanageable. But please take this away from the PowerPoint as something that you might find useful if you're dealing with costing sheets. One thing I didn't say is that if you are going for the contribution accounting approach, or if you are pre-burdening your labor rates with an overhead, you actually don't need a costing sheet. You can run the whole of Dynamics without a costing sheet. You only need a costing sheet if you are applying overheads using the overhead calculations that only a costing sheet will provide. But keep in mind, there is only one costing sheet per company. Basically, when you're in there, nobody else can get in there. If you're editing it and maintaining it, and it will only actually take effect when you save that costing sheet. And if there are any errors in what you've done, and it's quite easy to basically give the costing sheet data that doesn't make sense, but perhaps on basis, then it will error and tell you I can't save it. We've got a little bit of time left, so I am actually going to talk about something that I dearly love talking about, and I call it the overhead trap. Forgive me for a moment. I'm in the Pacific Northwest, and it's actually raining right now, but it was pouring earlier and overcast. No surprise for the Pacific Northwest. So what's the overhead trap? Well, if you look at overheads, we've got material, we've got labor, machine, and we've got overhead costs. I'm ignoring subcontract for the moment. And if we look back in time to when cost accounting was originally invented, I don't know, 120, 150 years ago, these were the kind of ratios. So for material, see if you can guess, it was about 50% of the cost was material. And then about 40% of the cost was labor machine. Visualize a workshop with a bunch of people in it and maybe one supervisor and no IT, very little small finance departments, CEOs that were not paid huge amounts of money. The overhead back in those days was as little as 10%. So if you were looking at overheading based on labor, which is what is kind of the traditional approach, most people ignore machine. They burden labor, but there's nothing to stop you burdening machine, especially in Dynamics. We've got an overhead rate here of 25%. So for every dollar of labor, I am accounting for 25 cents of overhead cost. In the finance world, that's called absorbing it, right? So you've absorbed that cost. At the end of the year, you can see if you absorbed it fully or not by looking at what your real overhead costs were. But what is it these days? See if you can guess for material. And I think it's somewhere around 30% of modern costs is material. And 10% or less is labor. And 60% is overhead. Now pay attention here. That's an overhead rate of 6, right? For every dollar of labor, I got $6 of people like me, people in IT, people in finance, your CEO, your cost of running the facility, the depreciation on all your equipment, right? That's accounting for like 60%. Now I want to ask yourself, if I've got something that cost me $1 in total, right? And I want to reduce its cost. There are two main ways of doing it, in my opinion. One is automation, right? Take labor out of it. And the other is outsourcing, at least to reduce the cost of manufacturing. So let's take the automation one. I find a way to take half my labor out. So now my labor content is 5%. But I am actually, if I'm not careful, if I'm not smart, I'm thinking that I am going to take 6 times that, 30 cents out of my overhead. And guess what? It's rather easy to justify automation when you're taking that amount of money out of it. Same with outsourcing. When I outsource to a foreign country with much lower labor rates, if I'm not smart, I am going to assume that my overhead comes out as well. Well, guess what? It's probably the reverse. If you automate, your overheads are probably going to go up. If you outsource, your overheads are probably going to go up. So what's going to happen at the end of the year when you do your absorption and you recalculate your new overhead rates? The overhead rates will go up. So let's say they go up. In this particular case, it would go up to like 12, right? Or more. But let's assume not every item do you cut labor in half. Let's say it goes up by 20%. Then guess what? Things that you thought you couldn't justify to automate last year, you now can justify because you think you're removing that overhead. So my advice when you're looking at automation or you're looking at outsourcing, ask yourself 3 questions. What am I doing to the material content? What am I doing to the labor machine content? And what am I doing to the overhead? And always justify based on those answers to those separate 3 questions. Well, we are at time now. So I'm not sure what I have to do, but let's move over to Q&A. Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat right now. Does anybody have any questions based? Okay, good. Oh, my apologies. Oh, thank you, Mr. CPA. That is a huge compliment. Yes, thank you for attending this session. And I hope you enjoyed today's sessions.